According to Wikipedia, a phoneme is the unit of sound that distinguishes one word from another word. A viseme is the shape that the mouth makes while making the sound. I originally got this idea from the Autodesk Learning Center with Soft Images Face Robot's lipsync function, which can be found on this video here. I also found this webpage on accident called Mixamo, where they sell models that are pre-rigged for video games or animation. The thing that caught my eye was this. It actually has a lip sync slider. Most of the information today came from digital tutors rigging the human face with Maya. Here we're using the same DAZ model that we did in the Face Shift series. If you remember, we made these face markers in a previous lesson. Today we're going to be using them both for the nomenclatures and to distinguish where we want to place the markers on our face. I'm going to make the size a little bit smaller so that we can work around them today. First, I'm pressing F to frame. Then I'm going to turn off the selection for the joints and also the selection for the mesh. Then we're going to turn on wireframe on shaded, which the button is right here. Now we can't select the mesh or the joints. Then we're going to go to Create, CV Curve tool, open up the options box and reset it. We want to use a linear curve. Now we're going to zoom in on the corner of the mouth, and by pressing the V key, we can snap to the vertex. So I'm going to start in the corner of the mouth, pressing 4 to make sure that I'm not applying my CV curve to the back of the model. Then, since we already have these markers, we know exactly where we want to put our next CV. So I'm going to go around the face, placing the CVs for the curve in line with the markers that we made in the previous lesson. Going into wireframe to make sure that I'm not attaching them to the back of the head. Then we're going to zoom into the corner and place our last CV in the corner of the mouth. Again, pressing V to snap it to the vertex, and at last pressing Enter to finish our curve. And this is what it looks like after we're done. Next, we want to go over the process again. I'm going to fast forward because this is a rather long lesson. We're applying the vertex to the same corner that we applied on the first one. So now we have two curves. I'm going to rename them lower lip and upper lip. Next, we're going to parent them into the upper and lower jaw joints on our DAZ skeleton system. The reason for this is when we move the lower jaw, it will also move the curve on the lower jaw. So when we open the mouth, the curve follows suit. Next, we're going to select our mesh, both curves. We want to go to the animation menu, Skin, Edit Smooth Skin, and Add Influences. In the option box, we're going to turn on Use Geometry and Lock Selected. Then add the influence for our two curves. Next, we want to go to Edit Smooth Skin and go down to the Paint Weights tool option box. It's floating, so I'm going to turn it off and use the tool menu to open it up on the taskbar. Next, we're going to select our mesh. Go into textured mode so we can see what we're painting, and hit the B key to reduce the size of our brush. Before we start painting though, we want to select our mesh, go to the channel box, open up the skin cluster, and turn on Use Components. Then we can go back to our Paint Weights tool, make sure that we have the lower lip influence selected, and that our opacity is at 1. Now we can paint the weights for the influence of the curve. The weights are applied on a per vertex system, so we can actually select single vertexes. I'm going to turn off the joints in my perspective view so that they don't get in the way. When I first started painting, I thought it was like a regular paintbrush. Knowing that I was selecting the vertexes made a big difference. We want to paint the influence around the entire lower lip, but not in the corners. I'm going to turn off the mesh on the inside of the mouth so that we can see what we're doing. We separated this mesh in an earlier lesson. Once we're inside the mouth, we're going to go back to selecting the vertexes on the lower lip for the influence of the curve that we made. Opening the jaw will help us select our weights. As I stated, I'm going to fast forward through this. It actually took me around 4 hours to rig the mouth on this model. Next, we're going to select the vertexes on the edge of the mouth to distribute them evenly between the weights of the upper and lower lip curve. This is rather tedious, but it pays off in the end. Here I'm moving into the orthographic view to make sure that I have the same vertexes selected on both sides of the face. By pressing Ctrl, you can deselect vertexes, as well as by pressing Shift or Ctrl-Shift, you can add vertexes. Once we have the vertexes selected, we're going to go to the Window tab under General Editors and open up the Component Editor. Under the smooth skins, we have access to the influences for each vertex. I should have chosen the lower jaw curve first, but instead I put all the influence on the upper jaw, then losing the ability to split it with the lower jaw, and I had to reselect the vertexes a second time. This time I start with the lower jaw, adding a 50% influence on the vertexes. This splits them up evenly between the upper and lower curve influence. Now if we go back to the perspective view, in object mode, we're going to select the vertexes of each curve. First I select the curve, then go into wireframe and go to control vertex mode. We're going to first add influences on the 3 center vertexes, going up to create deformers and adding a cluster. In the option box, we're going to reset it. Then click add. Next we'll select our curve again, right click, control vertex, click drag select the vertex, and press G to repeat our last command. Repeating this process for the 3 vertexes on the lower curve, as well as the 3 on the upper curve. Next we want to select both curves, and click select control vertex first on the first curve, and then maneuver around until we can select the control vertexes on the second curve. This is rather difficult with the mesh being so dense. Once we have control vertex selected on both curves, we're going to click to select the corner vertex on both curves at the same time. pressing G once again to add a cluster to it. Then I'm double checking to make sure that I have both curves selected. Repeating the process again for the right side. This time actually selecting the cluster from the menu. Create deformers, cluster. Now that we have our clusters created, we're going to name them. Once again, using the naming convention that we first created when we added the markers on our face. Going to hide the body joints so that just the face joints show up. Then we're going to turn on joint selection up on the top tab. By double-clicking, we can open up the edit function, then pressing Ctrl-C to copy the name, and then Ctrl-V to paste it on the cluster. This would be a lot faster than looking it up and writing them out longhand. Then we're going to hide our face clusters and turn the body skeleton and the mesh back on. Now, if we select the clusters, we have access to multiple control rigs on the mouth. As you can see, they still need to be adjusted some. We're going to start in the corner of the mouth and key the translate at 1 and then move it out to 9. It seems that I already have the jaw keyed, so we're going to go to the jaw and unkey the rotate. Going back down to the timeline and moving it up to frame 9, we're going to key the translate by moving it back into the smile position. In the beginning, we don't want to go very extreme before we add our skin weights. Then we're once again going to select our mesh, go to the Paint Skin Weights tool, open up the toolbox, make sure that we have the correct curve selected for the lower lip, we're going to start out by using the replace to touch up the sides. Then we're going to reduce the value to 0.1. Instead of using the replace function, we're going to switch to the add function. This way we can slowly increase the value per the vertex to give it more influence on the curve dynamic. I'm going to fast forward through this because it took a while. As you can see, I'm just doing one side of the mouth. Then we're going to turn on the smooth function and even up the displacement. I found that it works better when using a larger brush head with the smooth function. By repeating this process over and over again, we're making progress. Eventually, we get a more natural looking smile. That looks more normal. Instead of repeating the process for the right side, once we're happy with our skin weights, we're going to select our mesh. After breaking the connections for our keyed cluster, we're going to go up to Skin, Edit Smooth Skin, and Mirror Skin Weights. In the option box, you notice that we have it set up for the Y and Z vector. This will only work if we are using a model that is on 0. If we look at our grid, we are centered on 0 in the X and Z axis. After we're sure that our model is in the correct spot and we have our settings right, we're going to click the Mirror Skin Weights tool. This will save us a lot of time. Now, if we select the right cluster, we can see that the skin weights have mirrored properly. We have a nice smooth deformation on the right cluster. Now that we have the corners of the mouth, we're going to move on to the 3 clusters in the center. Again, selecting the first cluster, using the translate function, and again keying it on the timeline. Moving out to about frame 9, moving our cluster into position, and then keying it again. This way we could just grab the time slider while we're painting. We don't have to worry about moving the cluster. This will allow us to stay in the Paint Weights tool. Once we have the upper lip selected, we're going to add some influence on the upper lip. This will give it a more natural flow from the edge of the lip up to the nose. Once we've blocked in and smoothed the basic points, then we can move the clusters out to the extremes to make sure that they are stretching properly. Once we're satisfied with our clusters, we're going to group them. I'm putting them in a group and calling it lip. Then we're going to take the group and parent it under the locator for our DAS model. This way, when we move the model, the clusters will move with the model. Now that we have vertex deformers, we're going to move on to creating lip rolls using component deformers. The first thing we want to do is select the vertexes on the lower lip. By pressing Shift angle bracket, we can increase our selection. It seems that I've selected some vertexes on the back of the head. By pressing Ctrl, we can deselect them. I seem to be having some problems with my selection marquee. So I'm just going to start over. First selecting 1 or 2 vertexes on the center, and then expanding my selection by pressing Shift angle bracket. This form of selection differs from the Paint Skin Weights tool because the Paint Skin Weights tool uses joints, while this system uses components. They both follow fairly the same principle. Just like the influences for the lower lip curve, we want to select all the vertexes except the ones in the corner. By leaving the construction history on, when we make a mistake like I just have, we can easily go back. Now that I'm satisfied with my selection, I'm going to go up to Create Deformers and add a cluster. By selecting the mesh and going down to Edit Deformers, we can go down to the Paint Set Membership tool, which will allow us to add or remove components from our selection. By pressing Insert, we can move the center pivot for our Translate tool. Once again, pressing Insert after we've moved it to where we want it to go. We want to set our lip roll down at the base of the lip. By pressing V, we can snap it to the vertex. Once I'm happy with its placement, I press Insert again. I can see immediately that I missed some of the vertexes for my component. Creating the lip roll will be influential in making the M visemes. Using the Paint Set Membership tool, I'm adding the vertexes for cluster number 9. Once we have our component select, I'm going to 0 the jaw rotation and test out our lip curl again. Seems like we have a good selection this time. I'm going to turn off wireframe unshaded. And go to the Paint Cluster Weights tool under the Edit Deformers menu. First, you have to select your mesh. Then you want to select the proper cluster. This is very similar to the Paint Skin Weights tool, except that it uses a component as opposed to a joint. I'm going to reduce my value down to 0.1 and replace the influences on the outside of the lip for the lip roll. We're really only interested in the max influence being on the center of the lip. I'm going to fast forward through this again because it's very time consuming. As you can see, I now have the influence on the center of the lip cascading out towards the edges. This will be very useful in making the donut hole mouth shape as well as the M sound. I'm renaming it lower lip roll. As you'll notice, I keep selecting this component for the jaw. As soon as I finish adding the influences for the upper lip in the same way using the component selection, I'll show you where that is. First, I'm going to take both the lip rolls and drop them into the lip menu, unhiding them. Now we're going to go on to creating the blend shapes. In Soft Image Tutorial, they show different visemes, and they also give a list of 40 different phonemes, but as you can see, they're in Greek. Preston Blair also has a large list of phonemes also. And I found this on Google, but I didn't care for any of those. This one is rather simple. I also found it on Google as well. I think we're going to try to imitate this. I also found this GIF of an MRI of a person speaking, because not only are we worried about the lip shapes, we also want to articulate the tongue. First, we see the tongue is touching the roof. Then in this second scene, we see that it's touching the back of the mouth. Next, we see that it's in the neutral position, even with the lower teeth. And in this scene, it's actually touching the upper teeth. If we move farther on, we can see that not only does the tongue play a part, but also the nasal cavity, the Adam's apple, and the throat play a major part in making sounds. If we move on to the next scene, we can see that the tongue is shaped in an S shape curled up against the roof of the mouth. Also, we can see that the nasal passages is completely open. In this scene, you can see that the tongue has filled up the entire cavity of the mouth, leaving no space whatsoever. And in the last, we see that the tongue actually goes outside in between the teeth to make the final sound. This is some great reference material. It helped me a lot. So I have my phoneme chart. Now I'm going to start making my blend shapes. I'll start by opening up the jaw just 2% and turning on my internal geometry. Next, we're going to adjust our lip roll to bring the lips out just a tad. Selecting all the components for the lower lip, we're going to lower it down till it's even with the bottom teeth. Next, we're going to select the left and right and bring them in just a hair to give the lower lip a fuller look. Using our reference material often to make sure that we're getting the shape that we want. Next, we're bringing up the upper lip roll and moving it up so that we can see the top teeth. This also took several hours, so I'm going to fast forward through it. First, I select my mesh, then I select my tongue mesh, and press Ctrl D to duplicate them. This will make the blend shape. Next, I'm moving them out of my group. Then selecting both of them and unlocking the translate function. Now I'm going to move them off to the side in the blend shaped area. First, I want to change the material so that I'll know that they're blend shapes. By opening up my hypershade, I'm just going to assign the default Lambert 1 material. I have my hypershade pinned to the taskbar, but it can be found under Windows Rendering Editor's Hypershade. Next, I'm going to go into the orthographic view and select the faces on the body mesh, leaving just the faces for the head visible. This will allow me to focus on just the head. Here you can see I'm having some difficulty selecting or actually deselecting the faces. It seems that the joints are still in the scene, and they are disrupting the selection tool. Finally, I catch on and turn off joint selection. Finally, when I have my faces selected, I go back to Hypershade and assign a clear material to the body, so I can just focus on the head. Now that we have our first blend shape made, we're going to go on to create the next 8. I'm going to rename them with the same as their phoneme sound. Then I'm going to zero out my mouth clusters to start from a base again. Again, selecting my jaw component to zero out the rotation in X. If you go into the attribute editor and choose the jaw joint shape node, under the display tab, I have display handle turned on. This is why I can see the component for my jaw joint even when my joints are turned off. It's rather difficult to see. But if I turn it off, you can see that the component is then gone. And by selecting the jaw joint under the display tab and turning display handle back on, you can see that the component is visible again. This also saves time. Now I'm going to continue on making the next 7 blend shapes. Not forgetting to adjust the tongue for each of the 8 phonemes as well. It's not against the rules to adjust your blend shape after you've used your mouth rig. Since I can't seem to quite get the shape that I want. I'm also moving the jaw forward as well as rotating it up and down. Eventually, I get the shapes I'm looking for. Now we're going to create the controls for our phoneme shapes. Going to go into the orthographic view and again select my CV curve tool. Under the Create CV Curve Tool options box, I'm going to select the linear curve. I could use a cubic curve, but it would end up looking more like a circle than a square. By pressing X, you can snap to the graph. I'm only making 3 sides to my curve. Then I'm going to go into Object Mode, and under the Surfaces tab in the submenu, under Edit Curves, I'm looking for Open-Close Curves. This will give me a square. Now I'm going to go to Modify, Center Pivot, Freeze Transformations, and scale it up just a bit. Again, Modify, Freeze Transformations, Edit, Delete by Type History. Next, we're going to go to Create and Text. In the Options box, we can enter the text that we want to create. I'm going to create the 8 phoneme sounds. A, E, I, O, U. By pressing Apply instead of Create, I don't have to open up the Options box again. Once I have the 8 phoneme consonants I want, I'm going to move them into position after scaling them down. Then I'm going to tediously line them up into the control box. This will give me a visual reference for which phoneme I'm referring to. Since some of the phonemes are similar, I'm going to try to space them so that similar phonemes are next to each other. This will give a smooth appearance when the slider rolls around the box. For instance, A, E, and La are similar, and Wu, Fu, and are similar. In reality, I don't particularly need a consonant phoneme. I could just use the jaw rig. Next, I'm creating a circle for my slider. Again, modify, center pivot, freeze transformations, and edit, delete by type history. Next, I want to select my square curve and go up to Windows, General Editors, Channel Control. At the very bottom of the center list, you'll find an option called Translate. I want to move this into the active channels. Then I'm going to select all my text and also add the template function onto their channel controls. Now, if I select all of them and turn template on by pressing 1, they are now in template mode and cannot be selected. Next, I'm going to take my circle, go to the attribute editor, limiting information under the shape node, and limit the translate for Z because we don't want it moving off the same plane as our control box. I could easily lock and hide Z, but I'm going to limit it from here since I have to do the X and Y as well. As you can see, now it can't be moved in the Z vector. Next, I'm going to move my circle to the upper and lower limits of the box. Turn on the limit information and use the arrow to transfer the information in the negative and in positive. Then repeating the process for the Y vector. By freezing the transformations, we can always assure that the circle will be zeroed when we set it back to 0. Now we have our control. As you can see, you can grab it and throw it around. It's not going to go outside the box. And if we zeroize it, it goes back. Next, we're going to lock and hide the rotate and scale attributes since we won't be using them. I've left the visibility on, but you can see that that becomes a problem. When you try to zero it out, it makes your circle invisible. So we'll turn our circle back into the visible realm and lock and hide this as well. Now that we have our control box created, we're going to group all of our curves. We'll call it Phoneme Slider. Next, we're going to label it by creating a new text curve called Phoneme. Once it's in position, I'll scale it down. Then we're going to turn the template function on in the channel box so that we can't select the curves for the phoneme label. Once it's templated, we'll stick it in the group with the phoneme control box. Here I'm trying to change the color by turning on the display overrides. Unfortunately, this does not work with the template function. It was worth a try though. Now that our controls are finished, we're going to make our blend shapes. First, I'm going to select the blend shapes for the tongue. Last, I'm going to select the tongue mesh. Then, under the animation menu, create deformers. I'm going to create blend shapes. By opening up the option box, we're going to give them the name of phoneme. That way we won't confuse these blend shapes with our phase shift blend shapes. Next, I'm going to select the blend shapes for the body. Lastly, selecting the Genesis base mesh. Again, create deformers blend shape option box. We're going to label these phoneme body. Now that we have our blend shapes created, we want to go into Windows, Animation Editors, Blend Shapes. This will give us access to our blend shape sliders. We're going to move this off to the side and use it in conjunction with our set-driven key. The set-driven key can be found under Animate, Set-driven Key option box. We're going to load the circle in our control as our driver. Next, we want to select our Genesis mesh. In the channel box, we're going to select the phoneme blend shapes and add them in as the driven. I never did actually get this to work, but instead I found that by splitting the phonemes up into two control boxes, they worked just fine. As you can see here, using the jaw to control the consonants and the two different boxes to control the various phonemes. This should work for a lip sync type situation.